Hi, everybody. Today's Monday, December 8th, 2025, and our dear friend Lasha Kasradze is here with us. Lasha, we had him on more than two times here, and I hope that you know him. Our audience know you, Lasha. I'm sure. But for those audience who are joining us right now, and you're not familiar with Lasha, he's an international relation analyst specializing in the post-Soviet space with a focus on the South Caucasus and the Black Sea region. If you want to see his biography, you can go to this description of this video. You can find there, you can, you know, get familiar to his work. And Lasha, let me start. I know that your background comes from Georgia, which is so important in the whole situation in the South Caucasus and especially Central Asia, and we know what's going on in that region as well. But when you look at the situation right now in Ukraine and the way that the United States somehow, that the national security strategy of the United States under the Trump administration has decided somehow to leave the burden of the Ukraine war on the shoulders of Europeans. And how do you see the situation, the dynamic that is going on within the Western, into, let's put it this way, considering the policies that the United States has in Ukraine and the reactions they're getting from Europeans?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me again, Nima, and thank you for that warm introduction. Um, uh, yes, so one of the administrations, U.S. administrations do this. They release this is a sort of a political culture in the U.S. That they release national security strategy papers. I think it's once in every administration, in each term, if I'm not mistaken. I was reading this actually a few days ago. All I can say is that I think it's heavily tilted. It's a huge departure from the past national security strategy visions, so to speak, and it's characterized by it's heavily tilted towards more pragmatic, transactional, sort of realpolitik, to put it very mildly. I cannot recall the exact quotes here. Perhaps I should have gotten some quotes out of that document. But the gist the gist of the document is that basically Europe has to take care of itself, the United States is no longer interested, strategically speaking, in babysitting Europe. I've said this many times before, and of course, great scholars and colleagues have said this, that the era of the United States or Europe generating this fear that the great Soviet Union, with its communist ideology, was going to dominate Western Europe, Eastern Europe. Well, it did, but then just sort of go, basically monopolize the continent, the old continent, and cause all kinds of strategic challenges to the United States. I think that era is over. We know that it's over, and part of the problem, part of the reason that what we are seeing today, I would argue, vis-a-vis Ukraine, Russia, and elsewhere, is this sort of process of figuring out what to do in the post-Cold War era, what to do with Europe. And I think if you are smart, you look at these things cleverly, you realize that Russia poses no national security threat to the United States and to the collective West, unless, of course, you build up sort of hysteria, as it has been sort of customary in the West, against Russia, based on their visceral hatred of Russia, of course, and you sort of restart this whole mythology that Russia is about to invade dominate the European continent militarily and pose sort of existential threat to. I mean, it's laughable to even for me to even. I mean, I say these things and it makes me feel sort of how simplistic and how absurd this is, and yet we have to talk about this in the peacetime, right? In the post-Cold War era, we still have to talk about this, and so that's my view on what this document says. There are other things also I just can't recall right now, but China, of course, we cannot forget. China, of course, is a big challenge for this administration as well. And they view it as the rising power and the potential regional hegemon, and based off of that strategy, the document sort of reflects that strategy, of course, and that raises even more questions. Well, then, if China, as we all know, is going, if it continues to rise and develop economically, although some say now that it's sort of plateaued, but being that, putting that aside, that hypothesis for a second, let's just look at China as the rising power and the potential regional hegemon. Why are we fighting with Russia? What is this? Why? Why are we wasting resources? Why did we sacrifice Ukraine? This potentially one of the wealthiest countries in Europe that could have been, if the collective West had any, I would say, sort of a shred of moral ethic and ethical sort of compass, they would have built up Ukraine. They would have turned it into some sort of very developed modern state. And yet, look at Ukraine now. So the question is, the question becomes, are we driving China? Are we driving Russia into China's arms by acting this way vis-a-vis Ukraine? And of course we are. Putin's trip to China recently, and then his few days ago, he just came back, I think, he was obviously there in India. He met with Modi. This shows that the entire sort of Eurasian condominium, it's sort of pulling geopolitics towards that side of the globe. And these pulling forces of geopolitics have been emboldened and, well, have been caused and put into action by foolish United States policy of neoliberal and neoconservative sort of messianic worldview. And today we're staring at the result, at this disastrous result of what caused and provoked, and people to this day think that the word provoked is a controversial word, and I don't believe that at all. This was a provoked war. Russia and Putin went out of their way, Putin's apparatus and sort of Russian strategic thinkers, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to become close with the West. And they really spit in Russia's face, let's be honest here. And they mistreated Russia. And they really gave Russia a lip service with all the democracy promotion and NGOs and shock therapies of the early 90s. And they were really toying with Russia. While a lot of serious people in the early 90s, including George Kennan, of course, not to mention Kissinger and everyone else, were saying that this was going to explode in our faces. The chickens would come home to roost eventually, and we are facing that. Of course, Mearsheimer predicted this also, and now we are witnessing that hubris, the results of that hubris. While I truly believe that all of it could have been avoided. So to answer your question, just to finalize, yes, the document is very much tilted towards trying to avoid everything I just said, meaning for the United States to sort of come home and calm down and look at its own problems domestically, America first, right? And to figure out a way to perhaps prioritize and compartmentalize strategically vital national security issues of the United States. Just look at the globe, look at the map, and pick and choose, but do not go there with sort of a symmetric approach where everywhere, every corner of the world has to come under the sway of liberal internationalism or democracy promotion and all that. So that's the gist of the document, in my view.
How does the United States see Russia today? We know that the war in Ukraine is coming to an end, and sooner or later they're gonna come up with a settlement, with an agreement in Ukraine. But you've mentioned how the United States sees China. What is the role of Russia in the mind of those people who are writing these documents? National security strategy, we had during the Biden administration the same policy. They were mentioning that China is, the ultimate competitor to the United States. How do they want Russia? What is the role of Russia in their mind? Do they really believe that they can separate Russia from China, or they are reconsidering that sort of strategy? Because right now I don't see Russia being, they're going to be able to separate Russia from China because things have changed
Yes.
drastically. You're
Yes.
taking that.
Yeah. This is courtesy of the whole neocon establishment. This is the courtesy of you know ideological fanaticism. This is the visceral. All this is based on visceral hatred of Russia. We can go into sort of cultural aspects of it as well, as Slavs being sort of backward peoples, or not Western, or and yet look at Russia with enormous culture, literature, enormous potential. Yes, of course, Russia has always had problems domestically, economically. Corruption has always been the problem. Russian elite betrayal has always weakened Russia. But nevertheless, the international system sort of goes through epochs of change, right? So let's just say from 20 to 4 years. First World War, Second World War, and then you have Cold War. But these things come and go. But for some reason, the United States and ideologues and sort of that eventually sort of tag the Western Europe and the collective Europe along with them, just fail to understand how to prioritize the vision, strategic vision, or recognize when a certain state is a threat and when it's not. And we all know that this sort of takes us back to the whole American exceptionalism concept, which is fine. Every great nation, every great country, state, every superpower has had that sort of myth creation, right? That they feed themselves with. This is understandable. But there's one thing to think of America as being exceptional, which, in my view, in many respects, it is. It's a young country that has accomplished colossal things. Let's just be honest here. There's been enormous things, but it has also made foolish mistakes to the detriment of everyone else, really. And to itself, first and foremost. There was this adage that the United States can go along and keep making mistakes, but because of its geopolitical location on the Western Hemisphere, surrounded by two oceans, and being the richest, wealthiest, most powerful country in the world, it shouldn't care to continue to be making these mistakes. And yet, no, it should care. And guess what? I think Trump realizes this. A lot of people have said that right now. The instinct that everybody talks about, Trump's instinct. President Trump knows when he came to power, when he became president, he understood that this madness had to be stopped. We can dissect his true intentions or his sort of inner thoughts and say, it was coming from the pure heart, that he didn't want any more wars. However you want to look at it, the fact is the man is a pragmatist. He understands he understands that the past 30 years of U.S. foreign policy has brought nothing but disasters for America. And that's why he became president. He understood that perfectly well. And he called on neoliberal and the bluff of the neocon neoliberal establishment. It's a fact. Now what we are seeing is, to a large extent, he's being sort of swayed again by the system, because the system never disappeared. Presidents come and go, the system stays. The deep state, that intention, that carries sort of deep intention of how they see the United States role in the world. That intention is still there. So I think Trump must be given credit considering the difficulties that he's facing. But at the same time, I think he could be, for example, with Russia, he wants deeply to stop this foolish war, this nonsense. This is insanity, and I think the negotiations that are taking place, as futile as they are, the 28th point plan, and he understands that with Witkoff's visit in seeing Putin, and with Trump's son-in-law Kushner being there with him, all this is theater. Of course, we understand that. Anybody who looks at these things on a deeper level understands that this is just theater, but it's a necessary theater, and it's also meaningful in many respects, because here is the American administration trying to figure this out. I don't think they will figure this out the way they're going about it, because Putin has his fundamental demands: no NATO, Eastern Ukraine has to be given up, territorial concessions must take place, and then on the lower chain, you have the whole ethnic Russian protection of Russian ethnicities there, ethnic groups there. But main fundamental points here are, giving up of the eastern, the Donbass region with all the four oblasts, as well as, of course, no NATO. And they just cannot seem to come up with a solution, because that's the fundamental. If you want a solution, that you have to meet those demands, period. But nevertheless, to answer your question, Trump does not view Russia as with that visceral hatred, nowhere near. If it were up to Trump, let me just simplify. If it were up to Trump, this would not have happened. This would have somehow been prevented. If Trump had been if Trump had years ago, perhaps bitten, the Obamas and the Bidens of the world and the Bushes of the world, and if perhaps this would not, I believe this would not have happened. Because that whole wave of neoconservatism under the Bush family and the Bush the presidency also went over Georgia first and foremost, right? Georgia was the first country that experienced the ire of this neocon craziness. Had there been Trump, or back then, there's a good chance that all of that could have been prevented. And Ukraine, we would not be looking at Ukraine the way we're looking at it now. So no, Trump administration doesn't have any hatred, particularly for against Russia. It's the system, it's the deep state. First of all, everyone says deep state is a conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy. Deep state is part of and parcel of any state, basically. Just the question is how powerful that deep state is, and America's deep state is extremely powerful. And so Trump really is fighting against that. But he does not share that sort of visceral hatred of Russia, I don't believe, with his colleagues in Washington, so to speak.
We know that deep state doesn't want anybody to challenge it, because they have some sort of ideology in the way they're behaving. But after all, you see in the United States, a new president can somehow bend those strategies, somehow give it a new angle, which is not the case in Europe. You don't see that happening in Europe. We have some sort of change in the United States, considering the Trump administration, specifically when it comes to the policies in Ukraine. But that is not happening in Europe. How do you see the leverage Europe has in Ukraine? Because I don't know if you remember when Donald Trump came to power, and they found out that mostly the communications with the Zelensky administration and Ukrainian were done by Europeans, basically by the United Kingdom and Germany and France. Somehow most of the communications were done in Europe, and the intelligence, everything. And right now, with the Trump administration, the case is worse. There is no connection mostly between the United States and the administration in Ukraine. They don't like each other, after all, in my opinion. But how do you see the role of Europe? Because on one hand, you can say that the war in Ukraine is coming to an end. On the other hand, you see that Europeans are trying desperately to continue the conflict. They're bringing up something so strange, for example, the frozen Russian assets to be used in Ukraine, not by Russia itself, but by Europeans. They decide about how to use them in Ukraine. Even with if we assume that they want to do something good to Ukraine, reparations, loans and something like that. But how do you see the leverage that Europeans have on the situation in Ukraine? Do you think that their leverage is diminishing? The leverage continues the same as it was during the Biden administration? Or you see some sort of coordination between those people in the establishment in the United States and Europeans against the current administration?
Well, first of all, let me just start with answering the question by saying that colonialist instinct for thievery in Europe, right, is still strong. They're taking away one of the biggest, largest states' assets, and they're being proud about it. They're basically stealing from Russia in broad daylight. Be that as it may, I think that it's obvious that the Kaya Kallasis of the world, and I cannot think of the other lady's name now. The EU chief, I believe, von der Leyen, Ursula,
Yeah,
all these
Ursula von der
Ursula
Leyen.
von der Leyen, all these geniuses with their, just look at them. No, I don't. Trump cannot stand them. Let's be less politically correct here. How can anyone understand what these people are doing or why? First of all, it's sort of self-destructive behavior, and they're running around thinking that they can put together military resources. They talk about these things. Macron has said this before, and now hearing bits and pieces of information where they might be putting together some NATO, troops to invade Russia, to challenge Russia. I mean, this is just they just cannot seem to get out of this hysteria, this vicious cycle. And the deeper they dig, the harder it is for them to admit that this is a huge problem. Of course, it's ideological, in my view. Of course, this is also that obsession that I mentioned that hatred of Russia. But this is, I want to say that, look, the United Kingdom, with its historic sort of traditional approach towards Russia in the South Caucasus and the Black Sea region, wants to weaken Russia, or that it wants to prop up, say, Erdogan and Turkey to balance against Russia, just like it's done in the past, or that it wants to, help weaken Russia by propping up Turkey and the whole Turkic world, for example. That was sort of the vision, let's just say, when the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917. The collective West was panicking. UK especially was panicking that, Lenin declares sort of exit from World War I, and the panic sets in, and they think that they're going to make a separate peace with Germany and the Central Powers, Russia is, and they try to sort of engage in this parasitic sort of geopolitical play where they think they can prevent that. So in other words, England, Europe, France, of course, have a history of trying to weaken Russia geopolitically. The Great Game, of course, is central piece of this analysis. But what is it today? What do they want from Russia today? Russia is getting along with Turkey. Of course, Russia and Turkey have a fractured, conflict-ridden relationship, but that's in the past. Okay, um, everyone understands, and I'm going to go into this whole Central Asia, Russia weakening panic that's been going on now. Um, Everyone understands that Russia and Turkey will bicker over the Black Sea, the Montreux doctrine, the Montreux, in 1936 Montreux Agreement that gave Dardanelles and Bosporus to Turkey to control the Black Sea. But Russia has been putting up with it. Russia is fine with it. They're working. There's a trade. I think Russia was building some nuclear power plants in Turkey. Um, and so relationship is paradoxical in many respects, but also it's also with Russia's brilliant sort of diplomatic core has been managed perfectly well. Erdogan understands this, even after Erdogan had given drones and stuff to Ukraine. Russia, they did not go to war with each other. NATO is Turkey is a NATO country. Obviously, it's understood behind the scenes that this is just bickering, right? Um, and so why am I saying all this? The context here is that it seems to me that von der Leyen's of the world don't seem to understand it. Macron's of the world don't seem to understand it. That there will be bickering, but it's a fundamental difference between, bickering and managing based on national security interests, your relationship with, say, littoral states and Turkey, for example, Black Sea, in the region, in the South Caucasus, in the Black Sea region. And another thing is to go out and export this ideologically ridden hatred of a state that provokes potential disaster, regional disaster. So, in that regard, I think Europeans first, just like this national security paper states, it's been recognized that this is what Europe has become. Both socioculturally, it has declined, in my view. The identity politics, the globalist neoliberal internationalism has really eaten Europe up. They were not like this 20, 30, 40 years ago. They understood certain things where, whether it's tradition, whether it's pragmatism, whether it's some sort of a serious way of looking at the foreign policy, statecraft, but now they're just acting as like children. Um, so, the old continent is gone, in my view, and without the United States, they're just paralyzed. They cannot do anything, and the United States is going to do just that. It's going to decouple from the West. It will always protect the West. It will up the game in an instant if it saw a serious challenge, serious sort of geopolitical, national security challenge arise all over again, which is highly unlikely, which is a fantasy. But in terms of committing, United States resources to protecting Europe, I think that era is over. And now Europe has to figure out how to keep the union, let alone make America continue to protect its whatever they think their national security is, or whatever danger they think they're facing from Russia, which is non-existent. Putin is a brilliant guy. He understands that all he wants to do is to preserve Ukraine, because Ukraine represents the existential threat from Russia. And by the way, when this started and demonization of Russia and everything, let's just think about this. Russia started this, invaded Ukraine from a weaker strategic position. It was made to do so. The West, collective West, understood that Ukraine is the heartbeat of Russia. And that's exactly the weak point that they discovered, right? And they tried to poke that geopolitical space, knowing full well that this was going to be an existential threat for Russia, and Russia would act. The only hope a primitive hope was that by acting or by invading or by defending its national security interests, Russia was going to go bankrupt, and the Soviet Union was going, sort of, it would be the Soviet Union 2.0. Russia would collapse, and then all this hyenas, from the Western corporations and all that would go in and conduct another, perhaps shock therapies and really prostitute Russia to the rest of the world. Well, that did not happen. Even though Putin had gone out of his way for decades to making an effort that, acknowledging that Russia was over, the Soviet Union was over, acknowledging the loss, and yet, no, they did not accept him. They did not. He extended the hand, and they slapped it away. And so now you have the result here, and all of that is because of that. Well, not all of it, obviously, but to a large extent, that hysteria that overcame the old continent, supported by the neocons in Washington, I think, has a lot to do with that.
Russia, we had the conflict between Russia and Georgia in 2008. Then it came the war between Russia and Ukraine. What is the lesson for those countries in the South Caucasus, basically, and in the Central Asia? I'm talking about Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Central Asia is so important with what has happened in Syria as well. How do you see the lesson for these countries? Because after all, the prosperity of region would build some sort of atmosphere that everybody can grow with.
Mm-hmm.
If you go the other way, you go the opposite way, they're gonna destroy everything. I think Georgia has learned that lesson, and they know what they want to do with the future. How do you see the situation in Georgia right now, and how do you see the lessons for these countries like Armenia, Azerbaijan? These are somehow so the population is not that much considerable, is that big, and the way that they're behaving, do you think that they're considering the threat of confronting Russia? On the other hand, Iran may join Russia, and we know that how important that region is for both countries. Even for China, China is so much interested in that region as well.
Nima, here is the irony of the century, if you ask me. Paradox. Let's just say in the post-Cold War era, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, all these republics believed in one thing and one thing only, and that was, here comes the West, we will be saved. The good life is upon us, that Soviet monster disappeared, and we'll be just fine. Because America will come in, spend a whole lot of money, do nation building, the likes of which we also say we all know after the World War II and Japan and South Korea and all that. And now we are at the point where, no, it's the road to peace is not with the United States, but with Russia. And here are the people. I'll probably be excoriated for this, but anyone thinking seriously about geopolitics, national security interests, great power rivalry, understands this. But the crazies don't understand it, and they've been powerful enough. The ideologically driven, sects really are powerful enough to cause major disruptions, right? To contribute a great deal to Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, when the truth is behind it all, or within, or in between the lines, right? Where no, you don't fight. If you want to have stability, economic development, trade, and make money, and have an incomparably better chance for peace and stability in the region, you gotta find the common ground with Russia. How foolish should tiny states with 3.7 million people for Georgia, and Armenia is right there with Georgia, 4 million, 5 million, even with Armenia's very powerful lobby in the West. How foolish do you have to be as a leader? And Azerbaijan went through this, by the way, in the early 90s with Elchibey. Gentleman's name was Elchibey. I forgot his first name now, who was extremely pro-Western before before the Aliyevs came to power. And how foolish do you have to be not to see the signs, not to be able to basically do some basic calculations, strategic calculations, and saying, look, we have this northern neighbor, equipped with the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, and as ugly and as poor and as down and out as it seems to be now. I'm just talking about the early 90s here. What are we thinking? That we are going to provoke it on behest of Washington and Brussels, and we're going to serve first people who are going to get hit will be us. Even if Russia loses, quote unquote, the war against the West, we will still lose as the small nations of the South Caucasus. Because Russia has, I've always maintained this, Russia has, even when Russia was down and out in the early 90s, it managed in the early 90s and then the mid 90s and late 90s to wage a brutal war. Chechnya 1.0, Chechnya 2.0, I think it was 1998, respectively, the last one. It subjugated Chechnya, Northern Caucasus, and brought it into its own fold. And it managed to do so, and the entire West stood by and watched it. And here is this poor, disheveled Russia, right? Post-Soviet sort of ghost. And then Georgia, Bush administration, the Clinton administration slowly start to look at Georgia, try to shine the light on Georgia, say, look at these people. They love us. They love the West. They've always tried to be part of the West. Of course, we'll never accept them. But guess what? Let's tell them that they're coming to be accepted. Let's promote, this brilliant hoax of propaganda, right? That, democracy promotion, human rights. And then, of course, let's up the ante and tell them that we're going to make them members of NATO. And let's support, if not directly appoint, really deeply disturbed leaders like Saakashvili, who actually we can easily persuade that he's going to join NATO, and we're going to help him return South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And with his help, we can unite Georgian territorial integrity, restore Georgian territorial integrity. And let's keep telling them these things and see what happens. And then 2008 happens. And this is exactly, I think, the causality of it is directly related to that, in my view. Perhaps not, it was not, it was a combination of things. It was the combination of that neoliberal, neoconservative promotion of liberal internationalism, that history was over. And it's not as simplistic, obviously. I mean, Fukuyama did say things that in his book that, would challenge his own thesis. But basically, there was a losing proposal. This was a lost case. Today, it is a lost case. And a lot of people, including Fukuyama, I think, admits it. That history was over, that borders didn't matter, that Soviet Union, just because it disappeared, now Russia would just, kneel in front of us. And if we could only install or help to install liberals in the Kremlin, such as Vladimir Karamurza, or, now, and the West loves this, right? So basically, these are robber barons, right? They Khodorkovskys of the world, the oligarchs, they really, and Berezovskys of the world, they really raped Russian post-Soviet economy. They fled the country, and the West meets them with open arms, right? Khodorkovsky now is supposed to be some sort of a freedom fighter. One of here's a comical example. In Georgia, this radical lady who hit a police officer during the protests got arrested and was sentenced, and the West, Europe, I know, they awarded her the Sakharov Prize. The Sakharov was the nuclear physicists, right? So all of a sudden now they are the martyrs, they are the freedom fighters. So that this is all hoax. That this is what the West has always done, even during the Soviet Union, when when they would flee and manage to flee the country, they would be met in the West as sort of champions of, and to a certain extent, actually, the early generation I respect. They did fight for freedoms and human rights under the Soviet sort of state terror, but Today it is being ridiculed, that entire movement. They don't even they don't even respect that aspect, right, of their own Western export. That's how this is how fanatical they've become. This is how low they have fallen. They don't distinguish between true human rights fighters and people who actually sacrifice themselves for that stuff, and some oligarch, for example, some guy who just appropriated state assets and then left the country, or got sentenced under Putin. And of course, Putin is a dictator because he sentenced this thief for 10 years in prison. And then we all know the whole Navalny problem, scandal, when Navalny, everybody was blaming Putin for killing Navalny. And then, one of the ironies of Western sort of liberal freedoms that we still enjoy here is that then they themselves write about it. That they, Wall Street Journal says, yeah, we just, we were peddling this nonsense that Putin was killing these people, and Navalny, for example. But then no, just like the Northern Pipeline. Just like, we all remember the humiliating stage presence when Schulz, I think it was, right, the German Chancellor Schulz, standing side by side to to Biden, and Biden says, "Oh, we have our ways of destroying that pipeline." And then it was, of course, Russia's fault. And then a few months later, Wall Street Journal writes that it was the Ukrainians, on behalf of America, of course, that blew up the pipeline. So this is the sort of cartoonish series of events that we've been going through, and I think it's coming to an end finally. Perhaps this is sort of extreme. I don't want to exaggerate. It's not coming to an end. It's always going to be there. It just has been checked by President Trump and his sort of worldview, and also the return of sort of the multipolar world. But the same applies to Armenia, obviously. We were talking about this, right? Where if they continue on this road, what is Armenia doing? I've always asked myself, fine, I'm going to separate the region from the security and national security interest to geoeconomic interest. If you want to do geoeconomic projects and get involved there, and you think that the West can help you out, even Putin will acquiesce to that. Putin acquiesced in the early 90s when the Clinton administration actually managed to grab, all those, pull the rug under Russia's feet and sort of put Georgia on the map when it came to geoeconomic and connectivity projects. And Russia couldn't do anything about it. But guess what? It didn't really matter, because Russia would always bring Georgia under its sway when it came to security threats, when it came to NATO expansion in the region. So that's what matters. Of course, Russia will be pliable and pragmatic when it comes to geoeconomic and trade issues. But again, if you look at the alternative, how brilliantly Russia made itself available to China and India, it's selling, sure, at a discount price. It's not all perfect, but Russia is doing just fine, as far as we can tell, doing business with China when it comes to trade, doing business with India. This trip was huge, by the way. This Putin's trip to India was an enormous achievement in my view. And the whole, even though, China, India, there is Pakistan there, there's a regional, obviously conflict that always sort of, has been in the background, of course, but that does not seem to make much difference. Both China and India are getting along with Russia. Putin stated that Moscow's role is not to drive a wedge between these two countries in the region. They just want to trade, and they want to balance against, in other words, strengthen the Eurasian continent, perhaps even create that Russia-China condominium on the Eurasian continent that the West has always been terrified. And so if that happens, and it's happening as we see, then that's the checkmate. Then the West will be tamed, in my view, in relative terms. And presidents like Donald Trump will say, okay, guys, we cannot be stampeding and steamrolling over everyone that disagrees with us. Here is China, here is Russia, here is India. We have to work with them. Of course, it's foolish that Trump, imposed tariffs. I think it was over 50% tariffs on India. driving India closer and faster into the arms of Russia. But that too can be fixed, I think, eventually. I think once that stability takes root, that checks and the balancing sort of check on Washington's and Brussels sort of madness really takes root, I think things will go back to normal. Stability will ensue, and I think things will go back to normal, and I believe that Ukraine problem will be resolved militarily. Trump won't be able to fix this diplomatically because they're not able to meet fundamental questions, answer fundamental questions that Putin has. First and foremost, security, no NATO, and then they're not going to give up Eastern Ukraine, right? I mean, how we're going to sit here? It's going to make Putin look foolish. It's going to be political suicide. It's existential. They're not going to give up Donbass. And now there is talk even Putin taking perhaps Odessa if they cannot come up with a diplomatic solution, which looks like increasingly is looking like they won't be able to. So the old continent is over as far as I'm concerned. Now the question is, will they even sustain the European Union? And we all understand that Russia's war with NATO. And by the way, if you remember, just a few days ago, Russia said we didn't start this, but if Europe wants to go to war with us, we are ready today. Remember that quote? He was right after I think he met Modi. He had a press conference there in India, and that's what he said. So the idea that somehow Russia will capitulate, or they're either going to die on the battlefield, a battlefield. Or the peace, sort of stability and peace will ensue, and they will go back to sort of normacy, where national security and vital strategic interests of major states, great powers, will be recognized as such, and the international life will go on.
Actually, he said that after the meeting he had with Steve Witkoff together with Kushner. He said that Europe, if they want to attack us, the response from Russia going to be different from what they're witnessing in Ukraine.
Exactly, correct.
Lasha, what is happening?
He said something along the lines of that in Ukraine we have been trying to do like surgical. And
exactly.
Actually, this is also another hysteria where West says, "Oh no, the Russia, I believe, has gone out of its way to make sure that they're not that they didn't engage in some total destruction and trying to minimize casualties and all that." I think that aspect of it exists. That aspect, Russia has been sort of cognizant of that. But with the European Union and with the NATO, it's going to get ugly. It will be a different type of war.
I think the war in Ukraine has proven that the United States cannot win a war against China or Russia, because somehow this conventional war, it can get nuclear, because if they go to war against China or Russia, it would get nuclear. There is no other option. That's why I don't think that the establishment, even the establishment in the United States, would go that far, But here comes the importance of the region, the South Caucasus. You see, the latest movement on the part of the British government coming up and going to, to the South Caucasus, trying to manipulate, even to Turkey, going to Turkey, Central Asia, they're talking. These moves on the part of the Europeans, specifically, not all of them, but specifically the United Kingdom, shows what would they do if the war in Ukraine, we know that the war in Ukraine has totally failed, to diminish Russia's power in that region, Russia's dominance in that region. And what else can they do? They cannot go to war with Russia and China conventionally. Then it comes to regime change. You saw the war on Iran, the attack on Iran. The main goal was the regime change in Iran. Just assume if something happened in Iran, what could have happened to the whole region? It would be devastating.
I don't think it's over. I don't think it's over either. It's over. Not over. I don't think.
No, it's not over. No,
Yeah,
no.
yeah.
I'm not. I'm sure that it's not over. But they know that the government in Iran is totally prepared. The war in Iran, they have prepared for that war, that attack on Iran for 22 years. Donald Trump himself said that. It's not just I'm making up things. He said that they were preparing for 22 years to attack Iran. Looking at what Israel did, it was a huge operation, by the way. The first 8 hours was somehow it was they got all Iranians by surprise. They didn't know what is going on. Then they came in. But after all, Lasha, when you look at the whole region, do you think are we gonna see some sort of regime change? I'm I'm sure that as I see what's going on in Iran, as I saw it during the war, I'm sure that it will not happen in Iran. It could be somewhere else. I don't know where that would be. And is Georgia one of them? Is Azerbaijan, Armenia going to go in that direction? And
Well,
what else can they do in that region?
Well, Georgia had that first taste of the regime change. It was basically called the Rose Revolution when Saakashvili came to power, and he came to power by with huge support. What's true is true, but domestic support, that is. But look, predicting for sure, excluding the possibility of another regime change or some sort of a color revolution taking place, I think would be foolish. Nobody can predict that. Nobody can. But under this administration, the probability of that happening is very low. Whatever one thinks of Trump or his administration. And now we see sort of Marco Rubio tries to sort of pull him down south, right? With Venezuela and all this craziness that's happening there. But in the South, I think that American adventurism in the South Caucasus is, for now, is over. The argument has been made that if, say, Trump's vice president loses or doesn't, if he runs, he has to run in order for this peace and stability to be maintained, to maintain that peace and stability in the region. If that happens, then of course there is danger of neocons returning with full force. But Iran is the main problem here. I think in Syria, you saw what happened in Syria. They replaced Assad. Russia was criticized, if you remember, but nothing really changed. And Russia is going to finish off Ukraine, and Russia is already shaking hands with the current Syrian administration. But I think there are red lines. I think Iran is a red line for Russia because Russia knows that it's the springboard for the rest of the regional disaster to follow. And I think if the Israeli American interests sort of prevail and they overthrow Iranian regime, then Turkey will sort of bandwagon, I believe, with them. It will be emboldened in terms of its Turkic worldview that it has in Central Asia vis-a-vis Azerbaijan. And I think Russia will be in a strategic disadvantage. So I think Iran is the key republic in the region, key country in the region. But I don't think that Russia will stand by and watch the Iranian regime fall. Strategically speaking, I think with the Zangezur corridor and geoeconomic projects, it's already a problem for Russia if Iran gets excluded, which is why this is being done. The Zangezur corridor, but that would give an increased power, regional power to Israel, backed, of course, by the United States and the collective West. And while, it's hard to imagine any conflict ensuing between Russia and Israel, it's what's behind it that matters to Russia. It's the influence. And as we all know, since the days of the Cold War, Turkey has always been sort of implanted as the member of NATO in the region under Kennedy, for example, and Khrushchev when they stationed rockets against Soviet Union in Turkey, if I remember that whole chain of events correctly. But Turkey represents a major force in NATO. And it has always played a brilliant balancing game between Russia, Iran, and the United States. But I think at the end of the day, I think Turkey will choose the West. It will choose the West if the region exploded and blew up. I think it would choose the West, and I think it would allow the West to use it against Russia in the region. Even though Turkey supports Palestine, and we've seen how
It's not just
anti-Israel.
Russia. It's not just Russia. China, I think, is so much there because the energy security of China is somehow dependent on what's going on in the West Asia. With the case of Iran, because without Iran, I don't see any country, resisting to the dictation coming from Washington. Arab states, they're not gonna resist any policy coming from any order coming from the Washington. The only
You mean
yeah,
absent China's interests? Yeah,
no, I'm talking about China is
as a balance.
Iran in that region gives China some sort of balance in the region,
Correct.
to play with other players. Without Iran, if Iran goes to the camp of the United States, it's all over.
Yes,
in my opinion.
Yes, and Putin also has played that balancing game with Iran's nuclear program. It used both carrots and sticks against Iran, depending on how it viewed its role with Washington mainly. But yeah, no, if the region loses Iran, for example, to the West, I think there will be a major change. I think China, India, Russia, they will stand behind it. I think that whole the current Eurasian shaping that we are seeing, the geopolitical forces, I think, that are being displayed, arising, I would say returning, I think present a good balance against that unfettered regime change operations in the region. I do think for sure that certainly that in the South Caucasus that era is over, at least for now. But with Iran has always been on the target, has always been the target, and so. But I think, again, checks and balances, geopolitically speaking, of Russia, India, China, won't allow that. Even though Pakistan is in the camp, the Western camp, and there is a regional conflict there, obviously, with India. I just don't think that another major regime change operation will be allowed, so to speak.
I feel somehow Iran and Russia are trying to get closer to Pakistan. They're trying to do something in Pakistan. We had the head of National Security Council of Iran going to Pakistan saying that we are prepared for everything. Everything is open, cooperation for everything. Go 100% cooperation between the two. I think that's not just the policy of Iran, the policy of Eurasia. They're thinking how they can save, how they can, make the region safe for each and every country, and get rid of these unnecessary tensions that exist in the region. Yeah.
Correct. Well, with Pakistan being traditionally in the camp of helping, the United States, I think Trump wants to sort of figure out a way how to sort of return to the Maghreb. In Afghanistan plays a role there, and Pakistan can be used for some strategic reasons that Washington still has in Afghanistan to implement its goals. But India is there, and Russia, India, Russia, China coalition, sort of,
Growing.
yeah, it's growing, and I think that will complicate things for the West to sort of restart the sort of parasitic, regional wars and conflicts. And Iran is the centerpiece of that whole equation, I think. But Iran won't give up that easily. And then it's got Russia, it's got sort of this Eurasian strategic sort of culture that is really, I don't think, what will allow another regime change to take place, of all places in Iran.
Yeah.
But
Thank you so much, Lasha, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always, my brother.
thank you so much for having me again.